the story of the Black Death does not begin in Europe. It begins thousands of miles away in the windswept grasslands of Central Asia, a place of nomads, caravans and empires that rose and fell like the shifting sands. It is the early 14th century. Trade routes knit together the known world like veins, the Silk Road, stretching from China across deserts and mountains, all the way to the bustling markets of the Mediterranean. Along these roads travelled silk, spices, precious metals, and something far more dangerous. Something no merchant, no soldier, no king could see, the plague. But at first, no one knew what it was. Out on the Asian steppe, rumours whispered of entire villages collapsing in silence, of animals dying alongside men, of a sickness that struck without warning. Travellers spoke of sudden fevers, of black swellings under the skin, of corpses piled high and left unburied. But rumours travel slowly, and the disease itself travelled faster. The world of the 1340s was already unstable. Climate shifts had brought what historians now call the Little Ice Age, harsher winters, failed harvests, and famines that weakened populations. The Mongol Empire, once united under Genghis Khan, had fractured into rival khanates. Yet the empire had left behind something powerful, a vast web of trade that connected East and West more directly than ever before. Caravans rolled day and night. Ports were alive with merchants. Goods moved constantly, and rats moved with them. Carried inside those rats were fleas, and inside those fleas, the bacterium Yersinia pestis, the true killer behind the Black Death. One of the earliest great outbreaks flared up near Lake Issyk-Kul in modern Kyrgyzstan. Archaeologists have found tombstones dated to the late 1330s where entire families were buried in the same year. The inscriptions are chilling, died of pestilence. These graves may mark the spark that ignited the deadliest pandemic in human history. From there, the plague moved westward, carried along caravans to Samarkand, then to Persia, and eventually to the Crimean Peninsula, where East and West collided in war. The Mongols, fierce horsemen who still controlled much of the steppe, were laying siege to the port city of Kaffa in 1346. Kaffa, a Genoese trading colony, was a gateway between Asia and Europe, its harbour crowded with merchant ships. For the Mongols, capturing it meant power. But in the Mongol camps, a new enemy appeared. Soldiers began collapsing, struck down by a mysterious illness. Within days, thousands were dead. Panic spread through the army. The Mongol generals faced a grim choice: retreat and admit defeat, or use the sickness as a weapon. They chose the latter. Chroniclers tell us the Mongols began hurling the corpses of plague victims over the city walls with their siege engines. Imagine it, a catapult flinging a bloated, blackened body through the air, crashing into the streets of Kaffa. Whether this was truly the first act of biological warfare or an exaggeration by terrified survivors, the effect was the same. Inside the city, fear and death spread. The plague had entered. Merchants trapped in Kaffa made their escape. They boarded ships bound for Constantinople, for Sicily, for Genoa. But they carried with them not just cargo, not just spices and silks. They carried fleas, rats, and an invisible enemy that would soon ravage the world. And so, the disease began its journey westward. But before we follow it into Europe, we must pause and imagine the scene. the bustling markets of the Silk Road, unaware they had become highways of death. The Mongol siege camps littered with corpses, the narrow streets of Kaffa echoing with the cries of the sick. No one knew it yet, but the Black Death had been unleashed, and as the last Mongol trebuchet hurled a corpse into the city of Kaffa, something invisible slipped onto the ships that would change Europe forever. Those ships that slipped out of Kaffa in 1347 did not look unusual. To the sailors and merchants aboard, it was just another voyage across the Black Sea, their cargo packed with silks, spices, grain, and furs. The harbours of the Mediterranean awaited them, as they always had, but in the dark corners of those ships, beneath the planks, inside sacks of grain, black rats scurried, and clinging to their fur were fleas already infected with a microscopic killer. When those ships docked, death docked with them. The first stop was Constantinople, the great Byzantine capital, a city of golden domes, bustling markets and crowded streets. Within days of the ship's arrival, people began collapsing in the marketplaces. Priests recorded fevers, swellings, bleeding, and bodies abandoned in alleyways. Constantinople, once the proud heir of Rome, was drowning under an invisible tide, but Constantinople was only the beginning. From there, the plague spread across the sea lanes of the Mediterranean, carried by ship after ship. Sicily, Messina, Genoa, Pisa, all fell within months. Imagine the moment in Messina. The Genoese galleys sailed into harbour in October 1347. Townspeople gathered, eager for goods and news from abroad, but instead of bustling sailors, they saw men staggering, coughing, dying on the decks. Some collapsed before they even reached shore. Terrified, the authorities tried to chase the ships away, but it was too late. Rats had already scurried down the ropes, fleas had already bitten new victims. The plague had entered. From Sicily, it moved north, climbing the spine of Italy. Florence, Venice, Milan, and beyond. Italy's dense trade routes turned into veins of infection. By 1348, the plague had leapt to France, carried into the port of Marseille. From there, it radiated outward like wildfire, up the Rhone Valley, across the fields of Provence, over the Alps. Paris, one of the largest cities in Europe, would soon face devastation. England's turn came that same year. In June 1348, a ship landed at the port of Melcombe Regis in Dorset. Within weeks, the countryside was aflame with sickness. By the end of the year, the plague had reached London, then spread outward to Wales, Scotland, and Ireland. And it did not stop there. Spain, Germany, the Low Countries, Scandinavia. By 1350, the plague had touched nearly every corner of Europe. It spread faster than anyone could comprehend. The numbers stagger the imagination. In France alone, nearly half the population may have perished. In England, entire villages were abandoned. Denmark lost perhaps a third of its people. Norway even more. Iceland, isolated in the North Atlantic, saw ships drift ashore with nothing but corpses aboard. The scale of death was unlike anything Europe had ever known. And because no one understood the cause, terror magnified the suffering. Doctors of the time were powerless. The medical theory of the age was based on the balance of the four humours: blood, phlegm, black bile, and yellow bile. They believed the plague was spread by miasma, poisoned air often linked to bad smells. Some advised carrying flowers or herbs to ward it off. Others recommended burning fires or bathing in vinegar or even bloodletting. None of it worked, and as the plague rolled from city to city, so did panic. Picture Florence in 1348. The wealthy fled the city, retreating to country villas in hopes of escaping infection. The poor were left behind, crammed in narrow alleys where the dead and dying lay side by side. The Italian writer Giovanni Boccaccio, who lived through it, described how fathers abandoned children, husbands abandoned wives, and neighbours refused to help each other for fear of catching the sickness. Florence became a city of silence and smoke, where carts piled high with bodies creaked toward mass graves. The bell towers tolled endlessly, ringing for the dead, until no one could tell which friend, which relative, which neighbour was being lowered into the earth. And yet the disease still moved on, carried further by trade. Everywhere ships sailed, the Black Death followed. By 1349, it reached the shores of North Africa. Cairo, one of the largest cities in the world at the time, lost thousands in a matter of weeks. Chroniclers wrote of cemeteries overflowing, of people collapsing in the streets. The disease then travelled east again, striking Syria, Lebanon, and beyond. Damascus, once vibrant, became a place of mourning, its streets filled with funeral processions. The speed of the plague defied comprehension. A single spark in one port town could ignite an entire region within weeks. No fortress wall, no royal army, no religious prayer could hold it back. The plague was not just killing individuals, it was unravelling the very fabric of medieval life. Markets emptied, harvests rotted in the fields, trade ground to a halt, and still the rats scurried and the fleas bit, spreading the sickness further. By the dawn of 1350, Europe was no longer the same continent it had been 3 short years before. Cities stood silent, fields lay untended, churches overflowed with corpses. 1/3 of the continent's population was gone, and yet the horror of the symptoms had only begun to reveal themselves, because the Black Death was not just invisible. It made itself visible in grotesque, unforgettable ways, on the very flesh of its victims. And as people began to see the black swellings rise beneath their skin, terror turned into hysteria. Terror turned into hysteria when the plague made itself visible. At first it was just a fever, a sudden burning heat that left the victim drenched in sweat and too weak to stand. Then came the headaches, splitting pain that felt as if the skull itself was being crushed from the inside. Soon after, nausea struck, and many began vomiting violently, some even coughing up blood. But it was the swellings that made the Black Death unforgettable. Within a day or two, hard, painful lumps began to form in the groin, the armpits, and around the neck. These lumps grew rapidly, turning from the size of a walnut to an apple. They were called buboes, from the Greek word for groin. At first they were red, then purple. Finally they turned a deep blackish colour, as if the flesh itself was rotting. The pain was excruciating. Victims screamed and writhed as the buboes swelled. Some burst open, oozing foul-smelling pus and blood. Others hardened until the skin stretched tight, shining like dark glass over the swollen flesh. But the buboes were only one form of the disease. In many, the infection spread to the lungs, creating what we now call pneumonic plague. This was even deadlier. Victims coughed violently, spewing bloody sputum. Anyone who inhaled the droplets could be infected. Entire families collapsed in days. Some historians believe pneumonic plague was one reason the disease spread so fast, leaping from person to person like wildfire. Then there was septicemic plague, the rarest and most terrifying form. In this version, the bacteria flooded the bloodstream. Victims developed black blotches across their skin, caused by internal bleeding. Fingers, toes, and even noses turned dark and gangrenous. Death often came within a single day. It was this blackening of the flesh that gave the pandemic its enduring name, the Black Death. To live in Europe at that time was to live surrounded by horror. Imagine walking through a medieval town in 1348. The air thick with the smell of rot and smoke. The sound of hacking coughs echoing from windows. Bodies left outside houses, marked with crude symbols so collectors could haul them away. Children wandering alone, their parents dead inside. Doctors tried to protect themselves with long cloaks, leather gloves, and strange beaked masks stuffed with herbs to filter the bad air. These plague doctors have become iconic symbols today, but in truth, they could do little more than record deaths. Their remedies, bleeding, purging, or applying poultices of herbs and animal parts, had no effect. Priests walked the streets carrying crosses, blessing the dying, but they too fell victim. Monks and nuns, who tended the sick out of duty, often died in such numbers that monasteries were emptied. The psychological effect was devastating. People began to believe the plague was a punishment from God, a divine scourge for the sins of mankind. Some communities turned to desperate acts of penance. Groups of flagellants, men stripped to the waist, beating themselves with whips tipped with iron, marched from town to town, chanting prayers and begging for God's mercy. Crowds gathered to watch, hoping their suffering would turn away divine wrath. But still, the plague did not stop. Fear twisted into suspicion. Neighbours accused neighbours of poisoning wells. Foreigners, travellers, and especially Jewish communities were scapegoated. In cities like Strasbourg and Mainz, entire Jewish populations were massacred, burned alive, or driven into exile. Violence added to the death toll. The horror was not just the pain of the disease, but the collapse of trust in medicine, in religion, in one another. And yet, even in the depths of suffering, daily life had to continue. Farmers still had to bring in harvests, bakers still had to make bread, grave diggers still had to dig. Though many were buried themselves within days, the living moved among the dead, unable to escape the constant reminder of their own mortality. No one could be certain they would live another week. Some turned to prayer, hoping for salvation. Others gave in to despair, drinking and feasting while they still could. A few clung to family, refusing to abandon loved ones, even as they coughed blood into their arms. The Italian writer Boccaccio, who survived the plague in Florence, wrote chillingly, "One man shunned another. Fathers and mothers refused to nurse their own children, as though they had not been theirs. This was the plague at its peak, swift, merciless, and visible on every street corner. But as Europe watched priests fail, doctors fail, kings fail, faith itself began to crumble. If prayers could not stop the plague, What power did the church really hold? If the clergy died as easily as peasants, where was divine protection? The Black Death was not only a biological catastrophe, it was a spiritual earthquake. And as faith cracked and splintered, a new question began to spread in whispers. If God could not protect mankind, then who could? If God could not protect mankind, then who could? This question spread like wildfire across Europe as the Black Death cut down rich and poor alike. For centuries, the Church had been the ultimate authority, the voice of God on earth, the source of comfort in times of crisis. But as priests fell in the streets alongside beggars, as prayers failed to stop the plague, faith itself began to waver. At first, many clung tighter to religion. Churches overflowed with desperate worshippers. Bells tolled day and night, summoning the faithful to beg for mercy. Public processions wound through the streets, priests carrying relics and crosses, chanting litanies. People confessed sins, gave away their possessions, and prayed for deliverance. But when no miracle came, despair deepened into doubt. Entire monasteries and convents were wiped out. Parish priests who remained alive often fled their posts, abandoning their flocks out of fear. Others died heroically while tending to the sick, but their sacrifice only underscored the question, why would God allow his most faithful servants to perish? The plague shook the very foundation of the Church's authority. It was not just a health crisis, it was a crisis of belief. And in that vacuum of faith, darker ideas took root. Some believed the apocalypse had come, that the world itself was ending. In Germany and Flanders, groups of flagellants roamed from town to town, whipping themselves bloody in public squares. Stripped to the waist, chanting hymns, they believed their pain could cleanse the sins of humanity and turn aside God's wrath. Crowds gathered to watch, weeping and praying, but the plague still spread. Even the flagellants began to die, their blood spattering the cobblestones in vain. Others turned to superstition. Strange remedies became common, wearing amulets, drinking potions of crushed emeralds, sitting between two roaring fires to purge the poisoned air. Wealthy households locked themselves away, sealing doors and windows, sometimes starving inside rather than risk infection. But perhaps the darkest response was the search for scapegoats. In times of terror, people demand someone to blame, and across Europe that blame fell on outsiders, especially the Jewish communities. Rumours spread that Jews had poisoned wells or conspired with the devil to unleash the plague. These lies, fueled by fear and ignorance, exploded into violence. In Strasbourg in February 1349, nearly 2,000 Jews were herded onto wooden platforms in the city square and burned alive. In Mainz and Cologne, Jewish communities were massacred outright. In many towns, survivors were expelled, their homes looted, and their synagogues destroyed. It was one of the darkest waves of anti-Semitic violence in medieval history, and it was born not of reason but of fear. Yet even as these horrors unfolded, the plague kept moving. It cared nothing for prayers or purges, nothing for scapegoats or sacrifices. Kings died, bishops died, whole villages disappeared, their churches standing silent over empty fields. And so ordinary people were forced to reckon with a new and terrifying thought. Perhaps the church did not hold all the answers. Perhaps the old order, with its rigid hierarchies and unquestioned faith, was weaker than it seemed. This was the plague's hidden power. Beyond the death toll, it loosened the chains of tradition. If priests could not save you, perhaps you had to save yourself. If prayers could not protect you, perhaps knowledge, reason, and new ways of thinking might. The seeds of change were being planted in the shadow of despair. Seeds that, in time, would grow into the Renaissance, into the questioning of authority, into the rise of science itself. But before those new ideas could flourish, Europe would endure another upheaval, because death on such a scale did not only test faith, it shattered the economy, tore apart feudal bonds, and gave birth to something entirely new. As the plague emptied fields, silenced workshops, and left streets deserted, the survivors faced a new question. How would society rebuild itself when 1/3 of its people were gone? As the plague emptied fields, silenced workshops, and left streets deserted, the survivors faced a stark reality. Life would never return to what it had been. The old structures of power, kings, lords, and feudal obligations, were shaken to their foundations. Entire villages had vanished. Farms went undeaded. Cities, once bustling with artisans and merchants, were eerily silent. Markets that had hummed with commerce now lay empty. The labour force had been cut by 1/3, sometimes even more. And in a world where labour was suddenly scarce, the balance of power shifted. Peasants and workers, once tied to the land by centuries-old feudal obligations, found themselves in unprecedented demand. Lords who had previously dictated wages now had to negotiate, offering better pay and benefits to ensure their fields were harvested. It was a reversal of centuries of hierarchy. Those who had been powerless now held leverage. In England, this shift sparked both opportunity and conflict. Landowners tried to freeze wages at pre-plague levels through laws like the Statute of Labourers in 1351. They demanded that peasants continue to work the fields for the same pay, ignoring the reality of the labour shortage, but many refused. Some migrated to towns or other estates offering higher wages. Some revolted outright. The peasants' revolt of 1381, though decades later, can trace its roots directly to the social upheaval caused by the plague. Peasants in Essex and Kent marched on London, demanding the end of oppressive taxes and serfdom. They burned manors, executed officials, and challenged the authority of the crown itself. Though the revolt was ultimately crushed, it marked a turning point. The old order was no longer unchallenged. The plague also transformed urban life. Cities that survived the initial waves of infection found themselves with a more mobile, empowered workforce. Artisans could demand better pay, and guilds grew stronger. Some skilled workers travelled between towns, seeking opportunity wherever it arose. Social mobility, once nearly impossible, became a realistic prospect for the first time in centuries. Women, too, found themselves in new roles. With so many men dead, widows and daughters managed estates, ran businesses and oversaw farms. The labour shortage forced societies to rely on women in ways previously unthinkable. In some regions, women's wages temporarily rose, and their influence within households and communities expanded. Economically, the Black Death created a paradox. Immense destruction followed by opportunity. The immediate impact was catastrophic. Crops rotted, trade faltered, and markets crashed. Yet in the longer term, survivors enjoyed higher wages, better living conditions, and greater personal freedom. In towns, a new merchant class began to emerge, laying the groundwork for the rise of capitalism in the centuries to come. Even the church, though weakened spiritually, had to adapt economically. With fewer parishioners and dying clergy, monasteries struggled to maintain their lands and finances. Some monasteries sold property or accepted donations from surviving families desperate for spiritual protection. Others converted estates into more profitable ventures, blending religious authority with practical management. The Black Death also accelerated technological innovation. Fields left fallow forced farmers to experiment with new techniques, crop rotations, and tools to maintain production with fewer hands. Watermills, windmills, and other mechanical innovations became more valuable as human labor became scarcer. In essence, Europe had been forced to confront a new reality. Survival demanded adaptation. The old rules, feudal obligations, rigid class hierarchies, unquestioned authority no longer held absolute power, and in the vacuum created by death and fear, the seeds of a freer, more dynamic society began to take root. Yet while the economic landscape shifted, the psychological and cultural consequences of the Black Death continued to unfold. Fear, grief, and obsession with mortality seeped into every aspect of life. Art, literature, and collective imagination were soon dominated by death itself, reflecting the trauma that had touched every European home. And so, as survivors rebuilt farms, negotiated wages, and walked through empty streets that were slowly filling again, they carried with them memories that would haunt their world for generations. The very notion of life, death, and the human condition had been transformed. Europe was becoming something new. Economically, socially, culturally, it was a world poised between the old and the new, between medieval stagnation and Renaissance innovation. But before the age of rebirth could fully arrive, the human mind needed to grapple with what it had endured. The horror of the plague did not simply vanish with the dead. It lingered, etched into stories, paintings, and songs, and it reshaped the way people thought, feared, and imagined. It lingered, etched into stories, paintings, and songs. The memory of death that had swept across Europe. The Black Death did not simply kill people. It reshaped the way they thought, lived, and imagined the world. In the aftermath, a profound preoccupation with mortality appeared in every aspect of life. Art, previously dominated by religious serenity or depictions of daily life, turned to the macabre. Skeletons danced through murals, leading kings and peasants alike to the grave. This dance macabre, or dance of death, became a visual reminder that no one, rich or poor, powerful or weak, could escape death's reach. Artists depicted coffins, skulls, and decaying corpses in intricate detail, blending beauty and horror in ways that forced viewers to confront their own mortality. Literature, too, shifted. Writers like Boccaccio and Petrarch captured the surreal and terrifying experiences of living in plague-ridden cities. Stories emphasized despair, survival, and human frailty, yet also glimpsed fleeting moments of human courage and love. The narrative focus moved from abstract ideals to the visceral realities of life and death. People sought meaning in suffering, attempting to understand the inexplicable scale of their loss. Public rituals and ceremonies also changed. Funerals became mass events. Communities buried the dead in collective graves, known as plague pits, often several layers deep. The sheer volume of the deceased created a new visual and emotional experience. Piles of bodies in open fields, churches overflowing, streets lined with the sick. Fear and awe mingled, leaving survivors with a permanent sense of vulnerability. This cultural obsession with mortality influenced religion as well. The church remained central, but its authority had been challenged. While prayers and indulgences were still sought, skepticism began to grow. Ordinary people started asking questions that had once been forbidden. Why did God allow this? Why were some spared and others not? These questions planted the intellectual seeds that would, over decades, blossom into Renaissance humanism, the belief that humans could understand and shape their own world. Music reflected the age as well. Composers wrote dirges and lamentations, echoing the pervasive grief of a continent. The haunting melodies and somber tones of these pieces mirrored the unease and sorrow in the streets and homes of Europe. Even celebrations carried a shadow, acknowledging that joy and tragedy were inseparable. Fashion and daily life also bore marks of the plague. Clothing often became utilitarian, designed to protect against infection, while extravagant displays were reduced. The obsession with cleanliness and the fear of contagion, however misguided by modern standards, shaped personal and public hygiene practices. Streets were swept, waste removed, and laws regulating sanitation slowly appeared. Psychologically, the Black Death left deep scars. Survivors struggled with survivors' guilt, anxiety, and trauma. Entire generations were shaped by the memory of parents, siblings, and friends lost. The human imagination, already capable of cruelty and beauty, now incorporated a heightened awareness of mortality, impermanence, and the fragility of life. Yet from this trauma, new creativity and inquiry emerged. The horror of death forced people to question authority, explore knowledge, and innovate. Physicians began to experiment with medical theories, even if primitive, laying groundwork for later scientific progress. Artists explored new techniques and perspectives, seeking realism to capture the human experience more accurately. Architects redesigned cities with better sanitation and planning. Education and literacy, once restricted to the elite, slowly expanded. People wanted to understand the world, not just accept it. Universities began to grow, libraries expanded, and the exchange of ideas intensified. The Black Death, while devastating, had cracked open the rigid structures of medieval thought, making room for intellectual curiosity and human-centered learning. Even storytelling and folklore reflected the plague. Tales of ghosts, spirits, and morality became widespread, often mixing fear with lessons about behavior and piety. Communities told stories not only to entertain but to process grief, preserve memory, and teach caution in uncertain times. And as the cultural landscape shifted, Europe moved closer to a new age, the Renaissance, a period marked by innovation, exploration, and profound change. Yet none of this would have been possible without the crucible of suffering. The Black Death, in its unrelenting terror, had reshaped not only lives but minds, laying the psychological foundation for a world that would question, learn, and create. That even as art, literature, and thought evolved, the human spirit could not ignore the legacy of death. It haunted daily life, influenced decisions, and lingered in memory. And as society began to recover, new forms of organization, trade, and governance would rise, shaping the modern world in ways no one alive at the time could have predicted. Europe was poised on the edge of transformation. Economically, socially, and culturally, the continent had endured a cataclysm that tore apart the old and forced the birth of the new. Yet the full legacy of the Black Death, its influence on science, governance, and human thought, was still to come. And as survivors cautiously stepped back into fields and marketplaces, they faced a question that would define the next centuries. How would humanity rebuild itself? And what lessons would it carry forward from the shadow of death? And as survivors cautiously stepped back into fields and marketplaces, they faced a question that would define the next centuries. How would humanity rebuild itself, and what lessons would it carry forward from the shadow of death? The Black Death had stripped Europe bare, leaving not just empty streets and fields, but also broken hierarchies, shaken faith, and transformed economies. Out of that devastation arose a new world, one defined by resilience, innovation, and the gradual assertion of human agency. Politically, the old feudal order had weakened. Serfs had gained leverage, peasants had demanded, and in some regions won better wages and freedoms. Kings and lords, who had once held near absolute power, were forced to negotiate with their subjects. The cracks in feudal authority allowed for social mobility that had been unthinkable before 1347. Over time, this shift contributed to the rise of more centralized states, trade-based wealth, and the gradual move toward early forms of democracy and capitalism. The church, though challenged and shaken, also adapted. It remained central to daily life, but its unquestioned authority had waned. Some clergy embraced new forms of service, education, and administration. Others retreated, allowing secular governance, trade guilds, and civic institutions to take on roles once dominated by religious authority. This balance between faith and reason would shape the coming centuries. Medical knowledge, though primitive by modern standards, advanced as well. Physicians began to observe patterns of infection, experiment with treatments, and record their findings. Quarantines, first imposed in cities like Venice, became a standard practice, demonstrating the plague, in its destruction, forced humanity to take its first collective steps toward understanding disease and prevention. Even globally, the impact of the Black Death was profound. Trade routes adapted, cities restructured, and societies across Europe, the Middle East, and North Africa faced population shifts that altered labour, culture, and politics. Europe, once rigidly hierarchical and insular, became more connected, more mobile, and more receptive to new ideas. Psychologically, survivors carried the weight of trauma, but also the lessons of resilience. Entire generations learned that death could strike without warning, that power was fragile, and that knowledge, adaptation, and cooperation were necessary to endure. These lessons became embedded in folklore, laws, and cultural norms, shaping the mental and emotional fabric of European society for centuries. And yet, the Black Death's legacy is not only in the distant past. Its echoes can be seen in modern responses to pandemics, in public health measures, and in the human instinct to adapt under pressure. Societies learned, painfully, that survival requires flexibility, scientific inquiry, and community action. By the mid-15th century, Europe had begun to recover. Cities were repopulated, trade flourished, and art, literature, and science entered a period of unprecedented growth. The Renaissance was not merely a cultural rebirth. It was a response to catastrophe. It was humanity's answer to the existential questions posed by the Black Death: how to live, how to understand, and how to create meaning in a fragile world. In retrospect, historians see the Black Death as a turning point, a before and after moment in human history. Before, Europe was tightly controlled by kings, the church, and feudal lords. After, it became a continent more open to free thought, economic mobility, and innovation. The plague did not just end lives, it reshaped them. It tore down old systems and created space for new ones. Science, commerce, culture, and social organization all bore the imprint of those dark years. The death of millions forced the living to ask questions that had once been taboo, questions about God, about nature, about power, and about human potential. And the answers, discovered over centuries, laid the foundation of the modern world. As the last echoes of the plague faded from European streets, the world that emerged was one forever altered, stronger, more adaptive, and more aware of both human frailty and human ingenuity. The Black Death was not merely a tragedy, it was a transformation, and as humanity moved forward, carrying memories of fear, death, and survival, the lessons of 1347 to 1351 would resonate across generations, that life is fragile, that power is temporary, and that even in the shadow of death, society can rebuild, adapt, and thrive. Europe, scarred and changed, had survived the unthinkable, and from its ruins a new world was born.